From 2006 to 2011, I worked in the electronics department at the local Walmart in the small city where I lived. During those 5 years, I had more than my share of unsettling encounters with strange customers, which wasn't entirely surprising given that the state hospital was located directly across the road. However, this particular experience wasn't just a typical creepy encounter. It led to me being stalked for nearly a year. It all began in 2010 on a night when I was working the second shift. I was in the middle of my usual end-of-shift routine when a woman, likely in her late 40s, approached me with a little girl who looked no older than 3 or 4. The woman, speaking softly, asked for help with her cell phone. She explained that she wanted to convert her phone into a straight-talk device, mentioning that another employee had told her I could do it. I took the phone she handed me, an old Verizon model that was about 6 years outdated, and I could tell right away that I wouldn't be able to fulfill her request. I informed her that she would need to purchase a new straight-talk phone and transfer her old number, a pretty standard procedure. I always took pride in my work and maintained a high level of customer service, often receiving compliments from customers. I assure you, I didn't do anything to intentionally upset this woman, but she was furious nonetheless. She began yelling, questioning why she should buy a new phone when she already had one, and accusing me of trying to upsell her. She ranted about how I was just a pawn of the corporation. Eventually, I managed to calm her down, and as she left, she warned me that I'd never find another job in town. Later that evening, as I was preparing to leave, my manager informed me that the woman had filed a complaint, claiming I had sworn at her granddaughter. Apparently, she accused me of telling the child to go away in much harsher terms. I explained the situation to my manager, who simply laughed, knowing it was entirely out of character for me to speak like that to a customer. I wish the situation had ended there, but it didn't. Over the next few weeks, complaints kept coming in about things I hadn't done, sometimes even on my days off. Almost daily, I was questioned by management about accusations ranging from being rude to customers to using drugs during breaks in the parking lot. It soon became clear that all these complaints were being lodged by 2 women, the cell phone lady and her adult daughter. They had even started monitoring my work schedule, showing up at the store regularly just to see me and later filing a complaint. This went on for months, to the point where management jokingly referred to the woman as my favorite customer. At first, I didn't take it too seriously and even found it somewhat amusing since I wasn't getting into trouble and everyone knew the complaints were baseless. But things escalated when the woman began following me outside of work. I started seeing her around town, and it became clear that she knew where I lived. She would often walk by my house, sometimes just standing outside, watching. Soon after, complaints started being filed with the city about my property. Everything from the grass being too tall to issues with my shed and fire pit. She even learned my girlfriend's name and began lodging complaints at her workplace. I was certain it was the same woman. She made her presence obvious, sometimes stopping by at work and acting as though she was the nicest customer, casually asking about my girlfriend or making snide comments about how I could afford my house on a Walmart salary. This continued for about 7 months. I confronted her a few times, telling her I knew what she was doing and asking her to stop, but she always brushed it off. Unfortunately, I couldn't report her since she had never directly threatened me. She was simply making my life difficult. By this point, everyone in my life was aware of the situation. One evening, while having dinner with some friends from work, we jokingly discussed the idea of turning the tables on her, stalking her in the same way she was stalking me. Initially, I thought it was a terrible idea, but my friends convinced me it could work, and they offered to help. Together, we came up with a plan that resembled something out of a revenge story. The plan was straightforward. Find out where she worked, learn her name and address, make complaints in the same way she had, and gather information on the rumors she had been spreading about me. We wanted to make it clear that we knew what she was doing and that we had strength in numbers. It didn't take long to gather the information we needed. As it turned out, she didn't even live near me, and I was acquainted with some of her coworkers. They kept me updated on the wild accusations she made and even tried to convince her to stop. For about 4 months, we mirrored her behavior, filing complaints and digging into her life. As we uncovered more details, I learned that her obsession with getting me in trouble went deeper than I had imagined. She had falsely claimed that I had assaulted her and encouraged others to report me. She even told the police I might be involved in illegal activities. Eventually, our efforts paid off. She began to realize that several people were now looking into her life and asking questions. During my last month at work, I didn't receive a single complaint, and I didn't see her around anymore. However, the day after I quit, I heard she was back at the store, complaining about a new employee and asking a manager why I had left. I'll probably never understand why she was so determined to ruin my life, all because I suggested she buy a prepaid phone. This event took place around 13 years ago when I was 10 and my brother was 8. We had just moved to a new town that year, and the local Walmart had an arcade near the service desk. Every time our parents took US grocery shopping, they would give us a few dollars to play in the arcade. Since the town had a very low crime rate and the arcade was at the front of the store where plenty of people were checking out, we always felt safe. One day, my brother was playing the claw machine, and I was standing next to him, trying to help him position the claw perfectly over a stuffed animal he wanted to win. Out of nowhere, a strange man approached the claw machine next to us. He inserted a quarter and started moving the claw around, but he wasn't really focusing on the game. Instead, he kept making eye contact with my brother, smiling without saying a word. His appearance stood out: long, thin hair streaked with brown and silver, pulled back in a loose ponytail, a camo trucker hat, and a scraggly beard. His smell was unforgettable, a mix of stale beer, ashtray, and something sour, almost like dirt or fungus. The man eventually made small talk with us, and although we were taught to be cautious around strangers, we still responded politely. After a while, we grew bored of the game and decided to move to another machine on the opposite side of the arcade. A few moments later, the man followed us, once again taking his place at the claw machine next to ours. At one point, a heavy-set woman entered the arcade and jokingly asked the man what he was doing with the two of us, snickering in my direction. The man responded that he was trying to win some stuffed animals for us. She then started playing on the claw machine on the other side of us, effectively trapping my brother and me between the two of them. This interaction felt odd to me. Initially, I thought the man was simply playing the games for his own kids, but he had been following us around the arcade, seemingly trying to win prizes for us the whole time. By now, they had spent nearly 20 minutes moving from machine to machine after us, and both had put quite a bit of money into the games. The man eventually mentioned to the woman that he was out of money and asked if she had any, to which she responded that she was broke as well. That's when my brother innocently said that he still had $1. It was at this moment that things became truly unsettling. The woman suddenly shouted in an angry tone, demanding that my brother give her the $1. The outburst was so intense, her face turned red, and her voice was so sharp and loud that I could feel the blood drain from my face. My brother, visibly shaken, handed her the $1. She then laughed it off, trying to play it as if she had been joking. A few minutes later, my father arrived. As I turned to tell him what had been happening, the couple quickly left before he could get a good look at them. My dad was furious when he learned what had happened. He took us to the front desk, where he explained the situation to the staff. They made an announcement over the store's intercom, asking everyone to be on the lookout for the couple and to report to an employee if they were spotted. The police were also called, though I don't recall much after my father's arrival. My dad later told me that the police had reviewed the security footage, but it was too blurry to identify any clear details about the couple. They left the store without purchasing anything, immediately after my father showed up. The couple was never found. Even now, whenever I see someone in Walmart who resembles them, I feel a surge of anxiety and do my best to avoid them. I worked as a cashier at Walmart for a little over a year, leaving in August of 2015 when I went off to college. As a cashier, I encountered countless people every day, especially at Walmart, where the flow of customers was constant. Over time, I stopped really noticing individual faces, except for a few regulars whose presence stood out. Among those regular customers was a man who became an unsettling figure in my workdays. He always wore the same Green Bay Packers hoodie and a Chicago Cubs baseball cap, and no matter how long the line at my register, he would wait just to have me check him out. What unnerved me the most was the way he stared at me in silence, speaking only occasionally, and when he did, he leaned in uncomfortably close. I began to feel uneasy whenever he appeared, though none of the other cashiers seemed to share my discomfort. One girl even mentioned that he was a family friend, which made me feel like I was overreacting, so I let it go. Despite my attempts to dismiss my gut feelings, the tension remained whenever he was around. One night, after I had been working at Walmart for nearly a year, I was scheduled for a 2 p.m. to 11 p.m. shift, one of the longer shifts that always felt like they dragged on forever. Those shifts were tiring, not only because of their length, but because I had to work through the transitions of 3 or sometimes 4 different customer service managers. The hours also took away most of the free time I had during the day. I was stationed at the self-checkout area that night, counting down the minutes until I could shut it down at 10:50 p.m. when the man walked through the front doors. He didn't hesitate, he headed straight for me. Immediately, my anxiety spiked. He asked if he could still buy a phone card in the electronics section. I told him I wasn't sure as I worked at the front end, but he could check back there. He seemed irritated by my answer but walked away without further comment. After about 10 minutes, he returned, holding a prepaid phone card. He complained that there was no one at the electronics register, so I went ahead and activated his card, handing it back to him while wishing him a good night. To my surprise, he pushed the card back at me, silently, until I asked if something was wrong. He responded, almost irritated, wondering if the minutes were already on his phone. I was confused by the question, as the minutes wouldn't be available yet since he had just bought the card. His response, however, wasn't what I expected. Frustrated, he demanded I reactivate his phone, slamming the card down in front of me. His tone became louder, and he leaned in so close I could smell his breath. He was angry, and I felt a knot of fear tightening in my stomach. I was barely 5 feet tall, and he towered over me closer to 6 feet and a half with a bulky build. The idea that he could easily overpower me crossed my mind, and I started to feel paralyzed. My dad had never yelled at me growing up, so anytime a man raised his voice, it left me rattled. Taking the card from him, I tried to follow the instructions, feeling terrified that I didn't know what I was doing. His cell phone slammed onto the scanner, and I could feel his impatience growing. As I dialed the number on his phone to add the minutes, it suddenly ran out of time, cutting off the call. I tried again, but I received an error message. Handing the phone back to him, I muttered an apology, explaining that something had gone wrong. He grabbed the phone, tried dialing a number, and when it didn't work, his expression darkened. His voice rose, echoing through the store as he accused me of breaking his phone. The store was eerily quiet, with no other customers around. He threw his phone down again and, in a low, menacing tone, told me to fix it. At that point, I was sure he was going to escalate the situation further. I managed to call a CSM for assistance, suggesting to him that someone at the customer service desk might be able to help him faster. He eventually walked away, still mumbling about how I had messed up his phone. I prayed I wouldn't see him again before my shift ended. As I began to shut down the registers for the night, he returned, standing ominously by the podium where I was working. My heart sank as he motioned for me to come closer, not speaking but gesturing with a finger. The fear I felt earlier returned, more intense. When I stood before him, he leaned in so close that I instinctively took a step back, but he moved forward again, smirking as he told me that someone had fixed his phone easily. His tone was unsettling as he added that next time, he expected me to know what to do. He apologized for raising his voice earlier, mentioning that he never should have acted that way, especially toward a pretty girl like me. He even reached out, brushing my bangs aside with his fingertips. I stepped back again, this time more noticeably. He offered to make it up to me by suggesting we go out for a drink, despite me insisting that I wasn't old enough to drink. He persisted, saying we could grab a few beers and go back to his place, but I declined again, making excuses about needing to wake up early the next day. His displeasure was clear, but he simply stated that he'd wait by the door in case I changed my mind. As soon as he walked toward the exit, I quickly shut down everything and rushed to find a manager, explaining the entire situation. Unfortunately, the third shift manager wasn't concerned and even dismissed my fears, insisting that this man was harmless, calling me dramatic. She didn't take me seriously, and neither did the other cashier nearby, who mumbled something about teenagers being overdramatic. When I asked if someone could walk me to my car, they said security had already gone home, and management was in a meeting. Feeling unsafe, I clocked out and hid in the bathroom for about 10 minutes before cautiously making my way toward my car. When I walked out, I didn't see him by the entrance, which gave me a brief sense of relief until I noticed him standing just outside the door, smoking a cigarette. He wasn't facing me, but I knew I had to get out of there quickly. Fortunately, I never used the front doors to leave, always opting for the side door instead. I closed the door quietly, hoping not to attract his attention, and hurried to my car, which was parked close to the building. Just as I was almost there, I heard him shout at me, asking why I was avoiding him. Fear surged through me as I sprinted the last few steps to my car. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine, not even bothering to put on my seatbelt. He was almost at my car by the time I sped off, still yelling that he just wanted to talk. I took the longest, most convoluted route home, making as many turns as I could to make sure he wasn't following me. When I got home, I told my dad everything that had happened. He was furious that no one had responded to my calls for help or taken me seriously. The next day, he called the store manager to complain, but I never heard anything about it after that. From that night forward, I would hide in the bathroom whenever I saw that man in the store, or if I couldn't escape, I'd close my lane to avoid having to interact with him. You hear a lot about the people of Walmart, and while many of the stories paint them as quirky or trashy, no one ever talks about the ones who are genuinely terrifying. I used to work the graveyard shift, a routine I had maintained for quite a long time. One particular night, about 25 years ago, I had caught up with my tasks, but couldn't back up the data I had worked on. Since I needed new disks to complete the backup, I decided to clock out and head over to a nearby 24-hour store to buy a fresh box. I planned to leave the receipt for the bookkeeper so she could reimburse me later. It was a different time back then. Floppy disks for storage, no cell phones in most people's pockets. A far cry from today's technology. I arrived at the store around 3 a.m., went in, and quickly found the discs I needed. While I was there, I decided to wander through the toy section, as it was early November, and I wanted to get some ideas for Christmas presents for my son and a few nieces and nephews. As I casually browsed the aisles, I had this odd sensation, almost like I could feel someone's eyes on me. Looking around, I noticed 3 men not far from me, all staring in my direction. I glanced at them long enough to register their appearances, noting their cold and detached expressions, but then returned to the toys, pretending I didn't notice their strange behavior. Since I was off the clock and not in any rush, I continued walking around the store, even making my way through housewares for a bit. But every time I glanced over my shoulder, I saw those same 3 men trailing close behind, always watching me. By the second time I spotted them, alarm bells were ringing in my head. Their appearance was unsettling. Pale faces, the kind that made me think they rarely ventured outdoors. They had a greasy, unhealthy look, as if they subsisted on junk food and lived in dark, closed-off spaces. But what disturbed me the most was their attire. Though it was a mild night, about 55 degrees, and I was fine in just a jean jacket, these men were dressed for a winter storm. They wore heavy coats, buttoned up to their necks, which didn't fit the weather at all. The only conclusion I could draw was that they were hiding something under those coats, and given their predatory demeanor, I feared it might be weapons. Eventually, I decided it was time to check out. As I headed toward the registers, I mentally prepared myself. If no one else was leaving the store when I did, I planned to ask the cashier to call security and request an escort to my car. But as I reached the front of the store, I saw the men standing near the entrance, muttering to each other. Then, as if coming to some unspoken decision, they stepped outside. As I paid for my discs, I noticed a man and woman standing behind me in line. I'd seen them earlier, and they didn't seem to be paying any attention to me. In that moment, I decided to use them as a buffer. After finishing at the register, I lingered for a bit, pretending to fiddle with my jacket and slowly making my way toward the exit. I moved in step with the couple, always staying just a few paces ahead of them. My truck wasn't parked far from the entrance, so I reached it quickly. To my dismay, the three men were sitting in a car parked directly across from my vehicle, facing it head-on. My heart raced, but I kept my cool. I hopped into my truck, locked the doors, and leaned back in the seat, staring straight at them. I knew they saw me, but I wanted them to know that I was aware of their presence too. The couple I had followed out of the store walked past me and the men, getting into their car a few spaces down. I watched them leave, hoping it would discourage the men. After a tense few minutes, one of the men in the car said something to the others. The driver started the engine, and they slowly pulled out of the parking lot. I watched as they merged onto the highway nearby, driving up the overpass and out of sight. Only when they were completely gone did I start my engine. I didn't head straight back to work, though. Instead, I took a detour, driving a few miles past the highway before pulling into a dark lot behind a strip mall. I turned off my lights and engine, waiting in silence for several minutes. I wasn't about to risk leading them to my office, which was isolated and typically deserted at that hour. Once I was confident I wasn't being followed, I started the truck again and returned to my job, my heart finally settling. I should mention that, even though I'm a woman, I stand close to 6 feet tall and weigh around 175 pounds. I've always felt that my size has protected me in many situations. That night, I was also carrying a loaded revolver as well as a speed loader with extra rounds. Yet, despite all that, I knew I probably wouldn't have stood a chance against 3 determined attackers. The experience was enough to rid me of my casual attitude toward running errands in the middle of the night. From that night on, I learned to trust my instincts whenever I felt like someone's eyes were on me. About 3 months later, my husband and I were watching the local news when the faces of 2 of those men appeared on the screen. They were wanted for a series of armed robberies. The realization sent a shiver down my spine, but it also confirmed what I had feared that night. I had narrowly avoided a dangerous encounter. Living in a small military town means being surrounded by a population that's mostly made up of 2 distinct groups. Military families like my own and the locals who've been here for generations. The area isn't known for wealth, and it shows. A lot of people struggle to make ends meet, and homelessness is rampant. The other group, often referred to as the locals, tend to fit into a stereotypical backwoods category. It's an area caught between the Bible Belt and rural living, where many are living in poverty. This stark divide between military families and locals creates a unique and sometimes uncomfortable environment. Near my house, there's a Walmart I frequent for quick shopping trips. During the day, it's filled with the usual shoppers, families grabbing groceries or others just running errands. But at night, the place transforms. Walmart becomes a haven for people who don't seem to have anywhere else to go. It's open 24 hours, so it attracts individuals who may be under the influence, wandering aimlessly or just passing time. There's always a handful of normal customers trying to grab last-minute necessities, but the atmosphere after dark is completely different. You can feel it in the air, and it puts you on edge. One night, around 11:30, I realized I was out of baby formula for my daughter. I needed to prepare her bottles for the daycare in the morning, so there was no putting it off. I told my husband I'd be back in a few minutes and headed out the door. The Walmart is just a short drive from our place, and by now, I'm used to late-night runs like this. As I walked into the store and made my way to the baby aisle, everything seemed normal enough. I grabbed the formula, and while I was there, I noticed a cute baby dress. I couldn't resist stopping for a moment to look through the clothing, and as I was doing so, I got that strange feeling that I was being watched. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of someone. I looked over and saw a man standing a few feet away, just staring at me. His presence instantly put me on alert. The man didn't look like he was just browsing or shopping. His disheveled appearance and the fact that he was staring without any attempt to hide it made me incredibly uneasy. He was a little taller than me, maybe around 5 feet 9 inches, with long, unkempt hair. His clothes were dirty, and he looked like he'd fallen on hard times. What really bothered me was the way he stood, his hand resting casually near the crotch of his pants, as if it belonged there. He wasn't close enough to touch me, but his stare felt invasive, and I could feel my heart rate start to pick up. I made an awkward attempt to diffuse the tension by commenting on the baby clothes, hoping he'd just move on. He didn't respond, only gave a slight smirk. The silence felt heavy, and I knew I needed to leave that aisle. I quickly said something about needing to get going and began walking away, heading deeper into the store toward the back. I figured I might as well pick up a case of soda before I left. The further I walked, the more nervous I became. I hadn't grabbed a cart, so I was juggling the formula and a 12-pack of soda in my arms, trying to act like everything was normal, but my mind was racing. As I made my way back to the front of the store, I could hear footsteps behind me. I didn't want to turn around and look, hoping it was just a coincidence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was the same man from earlier. His pace matched mine, and I realized he was deliberately following me. Trying to stay calm, I headed to the express checkout line, hoping it would be quick. As I placed my items on the counter, the man stepped into line right behind me. He didn't have anything with him at first, but then he reached over, grabbed a candy bar, and tossed it onto the counter behind my items. By this point, I was on high alert. The smell of body odor and alcohol hung in the air between us. I shifted my stance, moving slightly closer to the person in front of me, trying to put more distance between us. But he moved forward too, closing the gap again. Then I felt it. Something brushed against me, lightly but unmistakably. My breath caught in my throat as I realized he had touched me. I tried to stay composed and turned slightly, giving him a sharp look. He mumbled something that sounded like an apology, but I didn't buy it. The cashier started ringing up my items, and just when I thought I might get out of there without further incident, the man pinched me again, this time harder. The shock of it made me whip around, and I raised my voice, telling him to stop. My heart was pounding, and my hands shook as I turned back to the counter. The cashier seemed unsure of what to do, but she asked him to step back or she'd call for security. Thankfully, he complied, though his glare was unmistakable. I finished my transaction as quickly as possible and hurried out of the store. Once I stepped into the parking lot, I thought the worst was over. But as I was making my way to the car, I heard the automatic doors open behind me. I turned and saw him walking straight toward me, moving with a purpose that sent adrenaline surging through my body. Without thinking, I broke into a sprint. My car was only 2 lanes away, and I fumbled for my keys as I ran. The closer I got to the car, the more frantic I became, hearing his footsteps behind me. I managed to unlock the car and threw myself into the driver's seat, slamming the door just as he reached the vehicle. The man pounded on the hood, shouting something I couldn't hear over the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. I threw the car in reverse and backed out of the space as quickly as I could, not caring about looking behind me. The tires screeched as I sped out of the lot, and I saw him fall away as I drove off. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and I drove well over the speed limit all the way home. When I finally got there, my entire body was shaking, and I felt like I couldn't catch my breath. I rushed inside, locking the door behind me. My husband was ready to storm out and find the guy, wanting to handle it in his usual aggressive way. But all I could think about was how close I had come to being seriously hurt. It was a terrifying reminder that you never know what people are capable of, and how vulnerable you can feel in a seemingly ordinary situation. Now, every time I leave the house, I make sure I have something for protection. The world feels different after an experience like that. I was a sophomore in college, just 19, when I had one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. I lived on campus in apartment-style dorms, and although the college was in a somewhat rough neighborhood, I usually drove a bit farther to a safer part of town when I needed to run errands, especially for grocery shopping. That night, I was planning to cook dinner and realized I was missing a few essential spices. Ordinarily, I would have just improvised with what I had, but the meat had already been thawing for a while, so I had to cook it. I considered going to the Walmart near my campus, only 2 minutes away, but since it was late, I didn't feel safe going there alone in the dark. It was close to a major highway, and being a young woman, I didn't want to take the risk. Instead, I opted for the Walmart located about 20 minutes away in a quieter neighborhood. I arrived at the store, picked up the spices and a few other items, and checked out without any issues. By the time I returned to my car, it was completely dark outside. As I was placing my bags in the passenger seat, I noticed a woman standing near the back of my car. She appeared to be in her 50s, and something about her presence immediately caught my attention. My car was quite old, well past its prime, and from time to time, people who were familiar with vintage cars would take interest in it. I assumed she might be one of those curious types, so I didn't think much of it at first. However, as I closed the passenger door, I saw her move around to the rear of my car and stop just a couple of feet behind me. I was parked next to a median, so there was no reason for her to be standing so close. She wasn't getting into a car nearby. She started talking about how her church had some leftover boxes of food from a recent drive and asked if I would like one. She gestured to her car, which was a little ways off in the parking lot. Instantly, something about her request set off alarms in my head. I had just bought groceries, so why would she think I needed more food? On top of that, from what I knew about local food drives, they rarely had leftovers, and when they did, those usually went to the community members who relied on such resources. It didn't make sense. As my mind raced, I tried to stay calm. I politely declined her offer, suggesting that the food should go to someone who truly needed it. My response was intended to sound reasonable in case her intentions were genuine, but deep down I was suspicious. She seemed unfazed and took a small step toward me, shortening the distance between us. She insisted once again that the food was just in her car, right over there. As she moved closer, my anxiety spiked. I instinctively reached into my bag, fumbling for a small pocket knife my dad had given me, but I was trying to stay composed and not let my fear show. After what felt like an eternity, she finally backed off, wished me well, and walked toward her car. As soon as her back was turned, I jumped into my car and locked the doors. I started to pull out of the parking spot, glancing around nervously. That's when I noticed the car she was heading toward. It was a white sedan, early 2000s model, and standing by the trunk were 3 large men. My stomach dropped. They were watching me just like the woman had, but their gaze was focused on my license plate. Panic surged through me. I had read stories online about people being followed after incidents like this, and my mind was already connecting the dots. The moment I reached the end of the parking lot aisle, I saw the men getting into the car. 2 climbed into the front seats while the woman and another man got in the back. My heart raced as they started to pull out as well. I knew I couldn't drive straight back to campus, so I took an intentionally convoluted route. I weaved through small side streets, taking sharp turns and making erratic choices, all in hopes of losing them if they were following me. I didn't see their car again after leaving the parking lot, but I wasn't willing to take any chances. By the time I returned to campus, I had calmed down a little, but the lingering fear still gnawed at me. Maybe I had been overreacting, I thought. After all, there were good people in the world. Perhaps the woman was genuinely trying to help. That sliver of doubt stayed with me until I noticed something that sent my fear into overdrive again. As I walked past the back of my car, heading to my dorm, I saw it. Written faintly in white sidewalk chalk on the paint was the symbol S and F. I froze, my pulse quickening as I realized I hadn't put it there. That was when it hit me. My car had been tagged. I felt the panic rising again, and I quickly wiped the chalk off with my sleeve. S and F might have stood for single female, which made the whole encounter that much more terrifying. Shaken, I locked my car and rushed inside. I texted a few friends, recounting the experience. They were just as disturbed as I was, and one friend agreed with my suspicion about the chalk marking. She, too, thought it indicated that I was a lone female, a potential target. After that, I called my mom, who was equally worried. By the end of the conversation, she had already ordered pepper spray for me, insisting that I start carrying it everywhere. For the next 2 weeks, I refused to go out after dark unless I had a friend with me. Even then, I was always on edge, looking over my shoulder. The strangest part of the whole ordeal was that I had chosen the farther Walmart because I felt it would be safer. I avoided the closer store that night, thinking I was making the smart decision. But in reality, the opposite had happened. In the end, I started shopping at the nearby Walmart again, and nothing like that ever happened there. It's frightening how quickly something seemingly ordinary can turn into a nightmare, and how easily I could have been a victim if I hadn't trusted my instincts that night. Both my fiancé and I work at a grocery store in a small mountain town in Wyoming. Recently, due to extreme fire risks, the town has implemented a Stage 2 fire ban. That means even smoking a cigarette outdoors could get you fined up to $1,000. With nothing much happening in town, local law enforcement spends their time patrolling parking lots, keeping an eye out for people smoking in public. Both my fiancé and I are smokers, and lately, we've been dealing with car troubles. So we've been sharing one car between us. The only time we can smoke is during breaks in the car since smoking outside isn't allowed. One day, my fiancé was working, and I wasn't, so I decided to visit him during his break. It was a chance to spend a few minutes together and have a cigarette. I drove to the store, parked near the entrance, and turned on my emergency lights while waiting, expecting him to come out soon. As I sat in the car, a vehicle passed by slowly, and the driver rolled his window down just a crack, barely glancing in my direction. The guy didn't stop, say anything, or even stare for too long, but something about him unsettled me. Feeling a bit uneasy, I called my fiancé, asking him to hurry up, mentioning the strange guy that had driven by. I understood that parking with my emergency lights on might draw attention, but plenty of people do the same thing in front of stores for brief periods. Besides, who breaks down right in front of a grocery store? Still on the phone with my fiancé, I saw the guy from earlier in my rearview mirror. He had parked his car and walked toward the store entrance. However, instead of going inside, he abruptly changed direction and started walking toward the side door near where I was parked. He then exited through the side door, and to my shock, he was holding what looked like a baseball bat. At this point, my nerves were on edge. I saw him approaching my car just as my fiancé was getting closer to the passenger side. The man made it to the corner of my car, and I realized he wasn't holding a bat but a sword, nearly 3 feet long, still in its sheath. He seemed to be scanning the area, acting as if he was looking for someone, but his erratic movements and the assortment of knives on his belt made me feel that something was very off. I tried not to stare, but from the few glances I managed, I could tell he was definitely on something. Likely meth, judging by his jittery movements and paranoid eyes. My fiancé reached the car just as the man turned and looked at him. I was preparing to hit the horn or make some noise to distract the man, but to my relief, he simply walked past my fiancé without incident. My fiancé got into the car, and we quickly drove further into the parking lot, both of us rattled by the encounter. We talked about how bizarre and terrifying it was, neither of us fully understanding what the man had been up to. To make matters worse, my car had been giving me trouble on the way there, so I decided to test drive it around the lot during my fiancé's break. Unfortunately, the problem persisted, only adding to the urgency of the situation. Since he only had a short break, we agreed that he should report the incident to the local police. We were both worried. After all, the man had seen both of us and might try something in the store or even follow me home. He knew my car, my license plate, and had seen us drive around the lot. The police came by a short while later, tracking down my fiancé while he was working in one of the aisles. After getting a description of the man, they immediately recognized him. Apparently, they were already familiar with him from previous run-ins. He lived in a trailer park just across the street from the store, and there had been an earlier incident involving him and one of the store's security guards. According to the police, the man had confronted the guard after being stopped for suspicious behavior. A few days later, he came back and ominously asked the guard why he was still in town, implying that he wouldn't be around for long. The town we live in is small and known for its scenic beauty, which attracts many tourists. It's also a popular spot for retirees due to its peaceful atmosphere and relatively high cost of living. The local population is mostly older and well-off, and it's not unusual to see people with rifles attached to their trucks or carrying guns on their hips. However, meth addicts wandering around with swords were something new and unsettling. The police found the man loitering in the parking lot and gave him a stern warning. They told him that if he showed up around the store again, especially carrying weapons like that, he would be arrested on the spot. Thankfully, I haven't seen him since. Though people carrying guns is fairly common in our town, it never feels as alarming as what we experienced that day. Guns are one thing, but a man with a sword wandering around a parking lot? That's something I'd rather not encounter again. I've always been a Central Texas girl, born and raised. This particular experience happened a little after I'd gotten my driver's license. I was in my early 20s, around the time when I had bright blue hair, something I enjoyed experimenting with. My mom had asked me to run to Walmart to pick up some groceries for dinner, and I figured, why not? I'd just gotten paid, so maybe I could treat myself to something too. Normally, when I went shopping, I'd bring my phone and headphones along so I could listen to music while browsing. But that day, I'd left my phone at home, charging. It was a bit of a nuisance, but I figured it wouldn't be a long trip, so I just deal with it. I grabbed a cart and made my way through the aisles, collecting the things we needed. As I was shopping, I started to get this odd sensation. It wasn't immediate, but gradually, I began to feel uneasy. There was something off. I couldn't quite pinpoint it at first, but it felt like someone was watching me. Trying to brush it off, I casually glanced around, noticing nothing unusual. There were families, a few college students, and then there was this one man. He stood out, wearing a dirty wife beater, looking scruffy and disheveled. I shrugged it off, assuming I was being paranoid. He wasn't doing anything, and besides, I hadn't seen him before. I figured it was just me overthinking things. So, I continued shopping, but every so often, that feeling of being watched crept back. I'd glance around, but there was nothing strange, nothing obvious. Except, as I made my way into the third aisle, I saw the man again. He was older, probably in his mid to late 40s, with short, unkempt orange-blonde hair, some facial scruff, and a noticeable facial tic. He wasn't holding a shopping cart, and something about the way he stood there, just staring, sent a chill through me. I turned away, assuming I must have been in his path, but he didn't move. I felt his eyes on me even as I turned the corner. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was being overly cautious. I moved on, heading toward the art supplies section to grab a new sketchbook. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still following me. The more aisles I passed through, the more uneasy I became. I had never experienced anything like this before. My instincts started to kick in, and I decided to test if he was actually following me. I deliberately changed my route, weaving through different sections of the store. For a brief moment, it seemed like I had lost him, and I let out a small sigh of relief. I made my way to the checkout line, hoping this unsettling moment was behind me. After paying for my groceries, I started toward the exit, eager to leave. But just as I stepped outside, I heard a voice from behind. I didn't need to turn around to know it was directed at me. The words sent a wave of fear through me. I recognized the voice as belonging to the man in the dirty wife beater. He was calling after me, his words loud enough to make my heart race. I ignored him and hurried toward my car, hoping he'd stop, but he didn't. His voice trailed behind me, growing more aggressive with each step. He kept yelling, trying to get my attention, but I was already throwing my groceries into the car, my hands shaking as I worked as quickly as possible. By the time I got into the car and drove off, I was trembling. The fear had settled deep in my bones, and I couldn't shake it. When I got home, I considered telling my parents about what had happened, but ultimately, I kept it to myself. I convinced myself it was a one-off incident, something random that wouldn't happen again. I was wrong. A few months later, my mom, my older sister, and I went to the same Walmart for groceries. I hadn't told anyone about the previous encounter, but since that day, I'd started carrying a pocket knife with me for a sense of security. We walked into the store, casually chatting about whatever was on our minds, probably discussing what we needed to pick up for dinner. Suddenly, I froze. My heart dropped as I spotted him, Mr. Dirty Wife Beater. He looked just as grimy as he had before, and to my horror, he was staring directly at me. His eyes didn't waver. His attention fixated entirely on me, as if no time had passed since our last encounter. My mom and sister noticed my sudden stop and looked at me with concern, but I couldn't speak. The man began to walk toward us, his focus unwavering. As he approached, he started talking about my hair, making comments that made my skin crawl. His words were crude, and the meaning behind them was clear. My mom and sister were visibly confused, unsure of why this strange man was singling me out. I felt paralyzed by the fear and discomfort his presence evoked. It was as if my body refused to respond to the mounting panic inside me. I finally managed to break away, quickening my pace as I moved ahead of my mom and sister, hoping to put some distance between us and him. He didn't stop talking, though, his comments lingering in the air long after I'd left him behind. When I stopped in the baking aisle, my mom and sister caught up with me, both asking what that had been about. That was when I told them about the first encounter, how he had followed me months ago and how terrified I had been. My mom became concerned, suggesting that maybe we should report him to security, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Something about the anxiety of it all made me feel like it wasn't worth involving anyone else. The rest of that shopping trip was spent with me constantly looking over my shoulder, checking to make sure he wasn't following us out to the car. It was an experience that stayed with me, one that I still think about whenever I'm out shopping alone. A few years ago, when I was in my early 20s, I had an unsettling experience that still lingers with me. At the time, I worked at a department store on the makeup counter. This job was all about providing good customer service and building strong relationships with clients, as we relied on repeat customers to keep sales going. Each employee was given personalized business cards to help establish a client base, and it wasn't unusual to get to know the people who frequented the store. The company trained us to be friendly, approachable, and always accommodating. One quiet afternoon, I was covering for a coworker at a counter that wasn't mine. The day had been slow, so I leaned against the counter, idly people watching. Most of the shoppers appeared to be browsing aimlessly, so I kept to myself. Then I noticed a man, tall and broad, moving slowly through the department. His posture was slightly hunched, his gait deliberate. His expression, though fixed in concentration, looked harsh, almost as if he was angry. He circled the makeup counter several times, but instead of checking the products, I could feel his gaze lingering on me. After a few uncomfortable moments of watching him circle around, I decided it would be better to greet him, just in case he needed assistance. When he finally approached the counter, I realized how imposing he really was. I wasn't even 5 feet tall, and with his height towering over 6 feet, combined with his heavy frame, I felt incredibly small in comparison. His presence was overwhelming. I remember being struck by his teeth, jet black in the front. They were so jarring that it was impossible to avoid noticing them. Despite his intimidating appearance, he spoke softly. It quickly became clear that he wasn't entirely coherent in his speech or mannerisms. He declined my offer of assistance and, out of nowhere, asked for my phone number. I was caught off guard. We had never interacted before, and his request felt unsettling. I explained politely that I was in a relationship and that it wouldn't be appropriate to give out my number. He didn't argue, but instead asked if he could have a business card for the counter, in case he wanted to inquire about products later. Since I was covering for someone else and wasn't at my regular counter, I handed him my coworker's card, hoping it would encourage him to leave. Thankfully, it worked and he walked away. I felt an immediate sense of relief. That relief didn't last long. Only a few minutes later, the phone at the counter rang. I answered with my usual customer service tone, only to realize instantly that it was the same man on the other end of the line. He asked for my personal number again. I repeated that I couldn't give it to him, but he insisted that he just wanted to talk. His persistence was unnerving. I decided to be more firm, mentioning that I should have told him I was married, hoping it would dissuade him. He apologized, sounding almost regretful, and hung up, I assumed that was the end of it, but over the next several weeks, I noticed him returning to the store. He never directly approached me again, but he would linger around the makeup counters, clearly looking for me. Each time I spotted him, I would find a way to disappear, ducking behind shelves or pretending to assist other customers to avoid any chance of him confronting me. My anxiety grew with each of his visits, and I became hyper-aware of his presence. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, but eventually, after weeks of this, he stopped showing up. I was relieved and grateful for his sudden absence, and life at work returned to normal. I had almost forgotten about the whole ordeal when, on one of my days off, I decided to go to Walmart. I liked shopping alone on my days off, enjoying the quiet time to browse at my own pace. After grabbing a basket, I headed to the cosmetics and wellness section, as most of the things I needed were there. As I walked past the supplement aisle, I suddenly locked eyes with the man from the department store. My heart sank. I had recently changed my hair color, and I wasn't wearing my work uniform, so I hoped he wouldn't recognize me. But when I saw him drop the items he was holding and start walking toward me, I knew he had recognized me. Panic set in, and I quickly picked up my pace, telling myself that there was no way he would follow me through the store. Yet, when I glanced back, I saw him pushing his way through the crowd, his expression even more intense than before. His blackened teeth were bared in a snarl, and he was headed straight for me. I didn't dare turn around again, but I could feel him closing in. The direction I had been walking led me further into the store, away from the exit. There was no way I was going to turn back and risk passing him, so I decided to follow the perimeter of the store, weaving through the aisles in hopes of losing him in the crowd. I walked faster and faster, trying to blend into the mass of shoppers, but I could feel his presence behind me, growing closer with every step. By the time I reached the registers, I felt as though he was right on my heels. Too terrified to stop at the registers, where I would be stuck in line and vulnerable, I darted into the crowd of people gathered around the self-checkout area. I spotted an older man with a shopping cart and instinctively ran toward him, latching onto his cart and explaining in a breathless rush that someone had been following me through the store. The man was incredibly kind, letting me stay close to him while we waited in line. He even offered to let me go ahead of him so I could leave faster. As I cashed out, I noticed my stalker pacing nearby, watching me, but unable to get closer due to the cluster of people. By the time I finished and grabbed my receipt, I couldn't see him anymore. I scanned the store quickly, but he had disappeared. Despite the relief, I didn't feel safe. I debated asking the older man to walk me to my car, but he was still busy at the register. Instead, I called my boyfriend, explaining everything as I hurried out of the store, practically running to my car. My hands were shaking as I looked around, scanning the parking lot for any sign of the man, but thankfully, I didn't see him. I rushed home, tears spilling over as I recounted the story to my parents, still rattled by what had happened. That day left a deep impression on me. I could feel the danger in that man's presence, as though something terrible could have happened if I hadn't managed to escape. His energy was aggressive, unsettling, and it filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. I had never felt so vulnerable and exposed, even in a store full of people. The fear lingered long after the encounter. I quit that job about 2 years later, and I only saw the man once more after that day. Yet, even though the years have passed, the fear of seeing him again has stayed with me. I can no longer shop alone without that memory creeping up, making me uneasy in ways I never used to be. The sense of safety I once took for granted is something I'm still struggling to regain. When I was 20 years old, I lived in a small, safe town in Michigan. I had a job working the midnight shift at a Walmart located in an even safer town just a short drive away. I preferred working these odd hours because I wasn't much of a people person. Every night, I would go home during my lunch break to check on my new puppy. Even now, years later, that little dog has been a source of comfort for me through so many of life's challenges. One night, like so many others, I was driving home for lunch. The roads were usually deserted at that time, so when I noticed a car trailing behind me about 4 miles away from work, I found it unusual. I had been driving for at least a mile or two with this vehicle still in my rearview mirror. I'm a cautious driver, always sticking to the speed limit, especially late at night. With the road so empty, I couldn't figure out why this car would still be behind me. There was no reason for anyone to follow me so closely on such open roads. As I continued toward home, the car remained behind me for another mile. I tried to brush it off as coincidence, but something about it felt wrong. When I turned onto a side street that led into a quiet residential area, the car turned too. At this point, my unease began to build, but I still tried to convince myself that it might be nothing, that perhaps the person driving simply lived nearby. However, when I reached my neighborhood and the car was still following, my heart started racing. I made the decision not to pull into my driveway. Leading a stranger right to my home wasn't an option. Instead, I kept driving through my neighborhood, taking an alternate route out to see if the car would continue to follow. To my dismay, it did. Growing more panicked, I decided to test my theory one last time. I drove in a loop through the neighborhood again, hoping that maybe this was all in my head. But the car followed me a second time, confirming my worst fear. At this point, I couldn't take any chances. I called 911, my voice shaking as I explained the situation to the dispatcher. I told her about the car that had been trailing me for miles and how terrified I was. She listened calmly and asked where I was. Luckily, there was a police unit nearby, only about a mile away from my location. I was instructed to head toward a 7-Eleven at a nearby intersection where the officers were positioned. As I made my way there, the car was still right behind me. The dispatcher stayed on the line with me, guiding me through what to do. She told me to pull into the 7-Eleven parking lot, and I did as she asked. The car followed me in, which only heightened my fear. Then she advised me to turn on my hazard lights so that the police would know which car to focus on. The moment I did, the person in the car must have noticed the police nearby because they suddenly attempted to drive away. But it was too late. The officers were already on them. While I sat in my car, shaking and crying from the sheer terror of the experience, the police stopped the vehicle. An officer approached me, asking if I knew a man named Michael Stonebreaker. I told him I had no idea who that was. He then informed me that the man they had just pulled over had a significant amount of heroin in his possession, and that this wasn't his first run-in with the law. He would be going to jail for a while. To this day, I don't know why that man was following me or what his intentions were. The officer said the man claimed he thought I was a friend of his, but that explanation made no sense to me. Why hadn't he tried to get my attention at the stoplight we'd both been stuck at earlier? Why hadn't he done anything to indicate that he knew me? Instead, he had silently followed me for miles through empty roads, never once signaling his supposed familiarity. That night was one of the most terrifying experiences I've ever had. It's a reminder that no matter how safe a place might seem, danger can still lurk. It taught me a valuable lesson. Always stay aware of your surroundings, no matter where you are or what time it is. Anything can happen, even in the quietest, safest towns. This took place only a few months ago, sometime in early July, I want to say. Anyways, my friend was over and had to make a run to Walmart. It was about 9 p.m., not too late, but a time my mother normally wouldn't let me out and about at. But given that I was graduated, my mom let us go. I was 18 and my friend was 19 at the time. A quick plan to get garbage bags, something that should have taken 5 minutes top, ended up taking half an hour. We got in, got the garbage bags, and walked around for a bit. We just kind of fooled around, browsing and talking, whatever. During this time, I noticed that my friend was acting kind of weird, but brushed it off. We were standing in line, ready to check out. My friend leaned in close and said, "Do you see that guy?" I glanced up, but didn't know what she was talking about. I still feel really guilty about this, for being too dumb to notice. We started walking away after checking out. Buying only garbage bags doesn't take a lot of time. As we were leaving, she started to explain. There was some dude that said hello, and being polite, she said hi back. We then saw him at checkout. Both of us being paranoid naturally, we brushed it off. We got in the car and we saw him in the parking lot again, no big deal. Deciding to play it safe, we decided to wait until he left. Turns out he had a couple of guys with him. They pulled over on our left, leering at us through the car windows. It was nearly dead silent in the car, but I could swear you could hear our hearts frantically beating. Even typing this up, I still get that panic. The car of guys quickly sped over, parking next to us. My friend immediately floored the car, pulling in reverse and speeding out of the parking lot. The guys followed. We honestly thought we were going to die, whether it be from going 80 miles per hour or by a group of creepy dudes. We quickly sped out of there, making a turn on some random road, the car of guys behind us at all times, going as fast as we were. At one point, they ended up passing us and waving before pulling into a church parking lot ahead and turning around to get behind us again. At this point, we're still going 80 in a 35 and getting closer to my house. Neither of us wanted to lead the guys to our homes, so we thought fast. Near my house, there's a little store where you can buy cigarettes, alcohol, candy. Pretty much a gas station without any gas pumps. We hauled ass to the back of the store, parking and moving to head in through the back. One of the workers was outside in the back and approached us. All we had to say, and have time to say, was, "We're being stalked." Luckily, the guy understood exactly and started to go up front. We peeked around the corner, and lo and behold, the group of guys were there around front. My friend and I proceeded to sneak in through the back. Now in the back on the left side is a deli station, and the right side is where the alcohol is. My friend ducked into the deli station, and I hid out on the right side. There was a female worker in the deli, and my friend made a signal for her to be quiet. The female worker pretended we weren't there at all. A couple minutes pass, and we hear the front door open. I peek around the corner, and it's one of the guys. I hide out in back, heart racing, hoping he doesn't come back here. Finally, a few more minutes pass, and the guy worker from before comes in through the back and tells us that the guys are gone. He chewed them out. Oddly enough, they flat out admitted to stalking us. When the guy worker pretended to be family, they quickly backed off, claiming they were only getting beer. We learned from the female worker that those guys are regulars and are always going on about creepy and sexist crap in Spanish, thinking she doesn't know. My friend and I end up hanging out for a little bit, just to make sure the guys weren't hanging around on a street corner. We're totally grateful to the guy and girl working there, because they were in complete understanding and worried about us.